Hello, my name is Paul, and today I'm going to talk about why I left Christianity. So, the main reason I left Christianity was because of the implications that it has on the psyche of a person and also um, theological issues I have with the character of God. Those are the main reasons why. There are a lot of reasons why I've left Christianity, but I think um, I would say the main one I could put it as the doctrine of hell, of eternal hell, specifically the Catholic teaching. So most of the what I'm going to be talking about in terms of deconstruction from Christianity comes from my Catholic background. I was a radical traditional Catholic. Um, I started as kind of a cradle Catholic. I got deeper into apologetics. Then, when I was in college, I joined a group of radical trad Catholics, rad trad for short. Um, but basically, um, I have studied other Protestant views, mostly for apologetics and trying to debunk Protestant views compared to Catholic views. Um, but yeah, just keep that in mind. I'll be coming from mostly Catholic perspective. So yeah, I think the first thing I'll talk about is the doctrine of hell. So the doctrine of hell, um, the implication is that most people are going to hell because, um, well, hold on, let me back up. Not That's not directly implied, but the conditions for hell is that you either have perfect ignorance of the truth, which means you had no way of knowing about the Catholic Church, right? And the Catholic official teaching, by the way, is um, if you're not in the Catholic Church, but you don't have perfect ignorance, you can't be saved. So, like, if you have like a hint of knowledge, like, oh, maybe I should be Catholic, but you just don't become Catholic, that means you're going to hell. That's doctrine. Um, and I think a lot of Protestant denominations have similar views on that kind of thing, where maybe not. Maybe some are more lenient, and I know that some have entirely different views on how. Like some people are annihilationists, which is I think you can interpret it that way from the Bible. I think it's a bit less plausible than Jesus said, where the worm does not die and stuff like that, and that kind of implies eternity um, and whatever. But yeah, there's a few things that the doctrine of hell does, and I think this ties in with original sin, but I'll start with the idea that if you don't know Jesus, if you don't know the truth, then you have less of a chance of being saved. So, for example, what is the motivation for Christians to go and preach to people in remote countries who have never heard the gospel? The purpose of doing that, at least for Catholics, is so that they have a greater chance of salvation. Um, because if they have perfect ignorance but follow natural law, then they can still be saved. But if they commit one sin that is sufficiently breaks natural law, then they are, unless they know the gospel, they're essentially screwed for the rest of their lives because they don't have confession, they don't have that sacrament, and so they're unable to receive forgiveness for their sins, and they're damned. Um, so I think a lot of people, when I say this, will have different perspectives. Some people will say, "Oh, that's fair." Some people will say it's not fair. I think it's pretty unfair because um, anthropologically, if you look at your chance of being a Christian, it really depends on where you're born. And people don't have control over where they're born. And this kind of gets into free will, but like, it just sounds like it's kind of unfair, right? We shouldn't, if it was purely a test of free will or whatever, if getting to heaven or hell was purely dependent on free will, then wouldn't everyone kind of start off with the same ground, right? Wouldn't it be um, all about, okay, it's all about free will, right? Because that's ultimately what is said to justify hell is free will, freely turning against God. And that ties in with original sin too. But um, so you'd think that we'd all start on this on a level kind of playing field if God was being fair, and if this was about our free will, we'd all start on a level playing field. But that's not the case. And what Christians will say is that, well, God gives everyone a chance at salvation. And what that means is basically, apparently, everyone has the opportunity to um, go to heaven. And apparently, that opportunity is fair enough for everyone, even though we've just pointed out that obviously there are um, very clear um, inequalities in the chance of someone has of becoming a Christian. So evangelists go and they want to bring people into relationship with Jesus to save them because let's say they did sin and they're going to hell. Okay, you need to go to confession. You need to go through the rites of the church, join the church. And so the other problem I have with this doctrine of hell is this kind of frantic mindset it puts on people. It puts this responsibility of people to be responsible for other people's souls. But it's so unclear as to what extent they're responsible that I think it can just cause a lot of anxiety for both Christians and non-Christians. Um, so if you believe that God has commissioned you, like the disciples, to go out and spread the word of the gospel, and you go and you're talking with someone, in your mind, you're kind of like, okay, God has given me this mission, this opportunity to bring this person into contact with Jesus, into an open state of heart. And I believe that God is working through me to do this. Because God works through humans because, you know, he loves working through humans, but whatever. But there's this general kind of command to go and spread the gospel. Um, Otherwise, if you fail at your task or if you don't let God speak through you in the fullest way, whatever that means, whatever that looks like, you could be responsible in part for someone's damnation. And so, when it comes to preaching and evangelism, and now I'm talking about more fundamentalists, because Catholics don't do this as much, but the fire and brimstone preachers who try to use fear to bring people to the gospel, because they're like, all right, well, this is the way we're saving them. We're going to bring them in contact with God, and so they use fear of judgment, and they push very hard because they want people to be saved and get away from their sinful life. And so, in a way, it's kind of like they are forced to use psychological manipulation. I'm not making a moral claim on this, like saying it's bad. Uh, you could say it's instead of manipulation, you could say, what is it? Persuasion, whatever. But the point is that they're persuading using fear tactics. Um, and I think that's what a lot of Christians actually do. I've talked to a lot of Christians, Protestant and Catholic, and the very first thing that you need to tell people when you are preaching them the gospel is they need to know about original sin. And Father Mike Schmitz has a video about this where he thinks that a problem with modern evangelism is that people are given the solution, but they don't know the problem. And so it's on the Christian evangelist to tell people what the problem is. So that problem is that they are broken as a person. They are tainted with original sin, and that means that they are kind of hopeless without God. They are um, fallen. They have something called concupiscence, which is the inclination towards sin. And the implication is that without Jesus, um, the only thing you can do is follow your concupiscence. And it's only through God can you do anything, right? I mean, Catholics will say, only, I mean, obviously everything only exists through God, and Jesus says, "Without me, you could do nothing." And the Catholic teaching is like all the good things we do are because of God. All the bad things we do are because of our fallen nature. Um, Kind of a convenient, setup there because you can just blame everything that goes wrong on yourself and give all the praise to God. And that way, you can degrade yourself more and more, and you can elevate God more and more, and that will just kind of reinforce your belief system, right? That you are a terrible sinner, and that God is your only hope, your only salvation from yourself, because you are so miserable. And this, I want to put important emphasis on this teaching of self-hatred in Christianity. This is everywhere. I would read a lot of ancient documents, church writings of the church fathers, and this kind of the self is considered the greatest enemy. And so what they mean by that is like your body is so evil. Um, and the Catholics will say, oh, well, we don't teach that the body's evil. The body's essentially good. It just has this desire towards concupiscence. But if you read any aesthetic practice text, Orthodox or Catholic, they will very clearly teach that we are so inclined towards evil that we need to uh, kind of like starve ourselves, like fasting, in order to stop us from rocketing towards this direction of self-destruction, which we are inevitably going towards without God. Um, and this teaching that the self is bad, it's like that's kind of what humility is all about. So you have some modern YouTube Christians who are like, oh, humility is just, it's not, like, for example, Father Mike Schmitz will say, well, humility is not thinking less of yourself, it's thinking of yourself less. Okay, but if you look at the ancient writings of the church, all of them will write about how we're, they'll talk about how we're dust, which is, maybe a little different, but they'll constantly say how the self is just like the worst thing. And there's common quotes of like, let there be, what is it? Let me decrease so that you may increase. Talking about the self decreasing and God increasing to replace the self. Um, that's the implication in that quote. I'm not saying that's what the teaching is, but you'll notice that I'm talking a lot about what's implied versus what the teachings are. And I think that the teachings are much more friendly to talk about. Like if you're telling someone about Christianity, you'll tell them about the teachings. But there's a thing with Christianity where the ancient writings or the spiritual writings and practices imply completely different things than even what the teachings say. And this is very apparent with the teachings about the self. The Catholic doctrine is that the self is essentially good. It's just tainted with original sin. But you'll see a lot of church writers, and I don't agree with that position either. But no matter what the position is, there's a very strong emphasis on hatred of the self, despising the self. Jesus says himself, unless you despise yourself, like deny yourself, despise even yourself, like those things are very common in Christianity. And that is a very useful psychological tactic to get you to become more dependent on another being. It's a very manipulative tactic, and I think that it's wrong because you're trying to that's what a narcissist does is they break someone down so that they are more dependent on that narcissist, um, and they justify it by saying, "Oh, it's for their own good." That's exactly what's going on here with Christianity. And as I started learning more about psychology, as I went through therapy, because I had very severe OCD, in in part, I think in decent part due to being this radical trad Catholic. And the reason I was radical trad Catholic is because I genuinely thought it was the truth. That's what happens, I think, when you go so deep into apologetics because I was more um, knowledgeable than the Protestants were that I talked to. And because I was Catholic, I was like, I am able to accept that the Catholic Church is true, and they're not able to because it's too difficult for them to accept that. Because there's some teachings that are difficult, but like scholarly looking at it, I still think right now, if you are to be a Christian, Catholicism is just the one that it's really the only option if you are looking for like a logical option, as logical as Christianity can get within those bounds, which I don't think Christianity is a logical religion, but I digress. Um, so I was talking about hell. I was talking about original sin, right? The idea that um, yeah, we're all tainted. So original sin is the idea that our first ancestors they turned against God. And so if you look at the story of Adam and Eve, everyone knows the story, so I'm not going to rehash it. But there's some problems with that because the reason we sin is because of the inclination towards evil. It's concupiscence. But Adam apparently was never given that, and Eve was never given that. They were created perfect. They had no inclination towards evil, so how could they disobey God? Well, people will say they made a free choice and they chose against God. So you're telling me that these creatures who are created perfect and essentially good still made a free choice against God, even though they had no concupiscence, no inclination towards sin. So they had no inclination towards that, but they still chose it. That's the creatures that God created that are apparently perfectly good. Um, that just doesn't seem to make any sense. And they'll say, oh, well, free will is a mystery, you know? I think that free will is probably more of a made up concept. If you look at how much hunger and brain chemistry, environment um, shapes people's decisions, like there's a very little space where that seems to leave free will. Even if you think about something, right? Like I believe in, yeah, you have the ability to make choices because it's just psychologically convenient to hold that belief because it's like, yeah, I make choices. I'm in control of myself. That's helpful to believe, I think, on a personal level. But when it comes to a moral level, you are only in control of yourself as much as your environment and safety and how you were raised, the trauma you went through. You're only free as much as that permits. And so another problem I have with Christianity is these objective standards of sin that don't take into account people's subjective experience. And I think orthodoxy is better, kind of more sympathetic towards people in this way. Where, at least from what I heard from Jonathan Pajot, is like the view is more like, priests will work with you to kind of work with you where you're at. And it's less about saying, oh, you need to stop these behaviors right now. It's more about actually trying to help people. Whereas the Catholic doctrine on mortal sin is that if you do something that is in under the Catholic definition of grave matter, if you do it with full knowledge and full intent, then you've committed mortal sin and you're going to hell unless you go to confession and sincerely repent of your sins. Um, so, the problem with that is that full knowledge and full intent um, can be very difficult to decipher, especially, I mean, in my case, I had OCD, so that made it a nightmare. But I mean, for anyone really, if you know, that the options are eternal torment if you don't do things right, or eternal salvation, the stakes are extremely high. So you're not going to mess around when it comes with full knowledge and full intent. If you really, really believe this, um, you know, what does full knowledge mean? What does full intent mean? Full intent is like, uh, you know, No one coerced you to do it. You were, you know, sober, that kind of thing. And you kind of planned it out beforehand. And full knowledge is kind of like knowledge that it's sinful, kind of knowledge of the consequences. That part's not really as clear. Um, but the problem with this is that there are so many things that are considered sinful, um, gravely sinful. As, for example, lust, the sin of lust. If you entertain sexual thoughts, okay, entertain sexual thoughts, which means to um, engage in them, which means to engage in them, whatever, and you do that knowingly and intentionally, to hell, because it's a mortal sin. That's unless you go to confession, you are damned. Um, so that makes it very difficult for someone who takes things very seriously, who really does believe in hell, who really does believe in these doctrines. Um, if they think sexual thoughts, immediately this is going to trigger tons of anxiety because your eternal salvation is on the line. Um, and one, uh, this isn't speaking for all Roman Catholics, but one popular uh, traditional Roman Catholic priest who is an influencer on YouTube, Dr. Chad Ripperger, or Father Chad Ripperger, said, "There's only so many mortal sins you can commit before God just cuts you off." That's completely debatable. I'm not saying if that's true or not. I don't think that's what. I don't know if that's what. That's not what the Catholic doctrine is anyway. That's what he said. But he's a pretty influential figure and very knowledgeable about the Catholic doctrine and the Catholic faith. Um, but so that brings up tons of anxiety. And what happens when a thought gets in your head and you're extremely anxious about it and you're like, this is a bad thought. Like, this thought is morally bad. I can't be thinking this. Or I can't engage with this thought. It's kind of like saying, don't think about pink elephants, right? Like that kind of thing where it's like, the harder you try not to think about something, the more it comes into your head. And when I mention this to Christians, that this is kind of problematic in nature, or at least Catholics that I've talked to, they kind of change, they kind of come up with ways around this. Maybe I shouldn't assume that they're doing this nefariously, but it's hard for me to, as someone who's experienced this difficulty, it's hard for me to take people to be super genuine when they are ready to make this claim, kind of to dismiss it so quickly without even kind of understanding or admitting, like, oh yeah, this is kind of problematic. But anyway, they'll say, well, no, it doesn't mean like holding on to it, saying, oh, I can't think about this. It doesn't mean um, like trying to push out of your mind. No, it just means not dwelling on it. Just not dwelling on it. And so they're kind of like invoking like this mindfulness, which is the strategy of just um, you know just let it go. Um, Most Christians don't teach that. Most Christians teach to pray when it comes to your mind. That's what the teaching is, to pray. And specifically, what Catholics will say about the sin of lust is that that's the sin you shouldn't try to fight. You should just flee from it. The exact wording from traditional writings is flee from it. And of course, when something scary comes into your mind, you want to run from it and get it away. Um, on the other hand, I really do think that Christians trying to invoke mindfulness are really doing it in bad faith, because the whole approach in therapy, and I think the specific person I talked to knew that I was in therapy and kind of used the terminology that I told him to construct his own argument. But anyway, the mindfulness approach is that if a thought comes into your mind that you don't like, you could just sit with it and just let it be there, and then eventually it goes away. But the whole predication of that mindfulness is that you're not morally judging a thought. And in Christianity, whether you say oh, in Christianity, oh no, the thought's not bad, it's just a thought. It's a thought that has the potential to damn you to eternity if you entertain with it. The image they give you in mindfulness to overcome anxiety about thoughts is you're sitting, like, let's say you're sitting on a couch next to the thought, and the thought's like represented by a monster or something. And you're just sitting with the thought, you're just sitting there. So I suppose the Christian approach would be, oh yeah, this thing that if you entertain with it, or if you engage with it at all, that's sitting right next to you. If you engage with that at all, right? If knowingly and with full intent, which is so vague, where it's like, okay, how long does it have to be? There's no guideline given for that. Um, for all you could know, is it's a second or a split second, but that split second you had full knowledge and full intent that you were engaging with that thought. You're going to hell. Imagine telling someone to sit next to that, and try to be calm, and to not be freaking out. That thought is never going to leave their mind because it's an immediate threat that's right next to them. And the Christian idea is to, yeah, like, flee from these thoughts. And then you have manipulative people saying, no, just sit with the thought. Um, Sit with this thing right next to you that could bring you to hell. And then it'll just go from your mind naturally, is the implication there. It's not going to happen. You cannot, if you are believe that something will send you to hell, that thing's not going to go from your mind because you're going to be worrying about it. Um, and so this is what happens, this kind of twisting of reality happens when you try to put moral judgments on like natural human functions like sexuality. This is what happens when you try to moralize that, is you just cause like these nightmares, these mental nightmares. Um, Now, when I this is something that people would say, this is scrupulosity, and yes, scrupulosity is OCD just applied to religion. That's the definition of scrupulosity. Um, it's religious OCD, and so I wasn't the only one in my community, in my church community, that had scrupulosity. In fact, pretty much everyone I've talked to has suffered from scrupulosity, and people deal with it in their own ways. But I'm a very logical person, and I the way I dealt with it was trying to understand how I can feel more at peace. Because when these thoughts would come into my head, um, I would get super anxious, and whenever I went to bed, I would have, kind of sexual thoughts would come up, to the point where I would sleep on the floor for a month or two at a time. I've done it multiple times. I would sleep on the floor, instead of in my bed, to try and decrease the prevalence of sexual thoughts, because that's, I mean, imagine trying to go to sleep and you have the threat of hell always looming over you. The only way mindfulness works is if you're not putting moral judgments on these thoughts. And entertaining the thoughts, that's still thoughts. It's the same thing. You're just thinking. So trying to put a distinction on entertaining the thoughts versus just having the thoughts be in your head, I think is, entertaining the thoughts, I suppose, would be something like you just keep thinking about it continually, um, as if it were kind of like rumination, as if you were ruminating on it. Um, but the difference is between that and rumination is that, well, the main problem is that you're told not to latch onto something that is so threatening, and at the same time is a human bodily function. Anyway, besides the point, I've gone a little too deep into that, but what I want to say is that I think it's extremely harmful to have this kind of moral view uh, of sexuality within your own mind. And what it did for me was it made me extremely anxious to be alone. And it would cause me to do these compulsions of prayer that would make the sexual thoughts go away. And it would cause me to develop great shame because of the sexual thoughts I had. And I thought I was doing everything right. No matter how much I prayed, it would come on. And people would say, um, well, this is just kind of like um, God testing you, um, or this is like one of those dark, not a dark night. I actually told my priest at one point I thought I was having a dark night of the soul because I felt so much despair in my faith, and he replied that that's only for people who dedicate their lives to Jesus. Um, though I did dedicate my life to Jesus. I think he was talking about people who are in monasteries. But for me, that didn't make a difference because I had truly dedicated my life to Jesus. And I didn't really know what he meant because I didn't think you had to be in a monastery to do that. I mean, isn't the entire point of being Christian to dedicate your life to Jesus? So I didn't understand what his implication was there. But yeah, it was. I was just thinking, why is God allowing this to happen? Because I don't want to go to hell. I just want to have a good relationship with him. I just want to be at peace and like pray to him and like do whatever he wants me to do. And I don't see how allowing these sexual thoughts to come into my mind is going to help me to grow. And maybe it's beyond me, but it just started becoming torment for me because the only way I could get rid of the sexual thoughts was by praying compulsively. And that became very difficult, and that just made my OCD worse and worse, as any compulsion does, practice enough. Um, and I was confused. I was confused as to why God was doing this to me. I've had friends send me things like writings, poems, Christian poems, where it'll be like, all the trials that happen in your life, they were from me, my son, from the perspective of God. Yes, everything that happened to you was from me, and it was from me to help you grow. But, when you're constantly tormented with the threat of being eternally thrown into damnation, it seems less of like a fatherly guidance, or like a father teaching his son, and more like a psychopath tormenting their victim. Okay, so moving on from the subject of lust, um, there's other things in the Bible, many things in the Bible that I just think are just screwed up. One of them is kind of like that the Bible teaches you to beat your children in order to discipline them. Um, Basically, like it says something along the lines of like if you spare the stick or or whatever, the rod, then your children will grow up to be kind of troublesome. Um, and let's see, also going into the Bible, just the character of God is just terrible. So I've read pretty much the entire Bible, except for some of the minor prophets. And if you see the character of God in the Old Testament, you might have heard in the past people saying, like, oh, God seems different in the Old Testament than in the New Testament. And Christians will come up with all these different ways to explain it, like, oh, well, that was the Old Covenant, or he was dealing with people in a place at a certain time where they weren't ready to hear the full truth. So he had to only give them part of the truth. Um, or we can't know what's going on in God's mind, or it's up to him. He created human beings, he can judge them. Um, Whatever. But there's things in the Old Testament, God, I think pretty much everyone knows this at this point, about how God commanded the Israelites to commit genocide, mass genocide, men, women, and children. In the promised land that he promised the Israelites, Christians will say, oh, well, they were a sinful people. The reason they were exterminated was because of their living in the land that God promised the Israelites, because everyone was sinful. The Israelites were sinful, but some were spared and some were killed. And actually, they were killed because of their ethnicity, because God explicitly told them, kill them, the whatever the name of that tribe was. So, besides that, slavery is actually directly permitted in the Old Testament, and homosexuality is uh, condemned by penalty of death. So, homosexuality is taught as inherently morally evil, and so it was absolutely necessary for God at that time to actually ban it. But it wasn't necessary for God to ban slavery yet, because he had to work with the culture, the society. Um, okay, but the problem is that you're saying that homosexuality is more problematic than slavery. You're saying that homosexuality is by nature morally corrupt, but owning slaves is not. Until St. Paul says something in the New Testament, where apparently there's no distinction between slaves and free. By the way, in the same passage, he talks about, and this is Alex O'Connor talks about this in his One Atheist versus 25 Christians video, but he talks about St. Paul in the same sentence that he says that there's no distinction between slave and free, says there's no distinction between man and woman, but Christians will take part of that sentence literally and part of it not literally. Um, like, so honestly, Christians just come up with whatever they want to believe in, based on the interpretation of the scripture. Like, I know there are Christians who are um, pro LGBTQ, and I think from the perspective of someone who really took the Bible seriously, I think if you were taking the Bible completely seriously and believe it's all the inspired word of God, I think it's very difficult for you to say that the Bible does not explicitly teach against homosexuality, especially when St. Paul says explicitly that homosexuals will not inherit the kingdom of heaven. And in the Old Testament, it's punishable by death, by stoning. And the earliest churches in the world, and pretty much every mainline church, I'll talk about the Catholic Church, the Orthodox Church, both of those condemn homosexuality. I think it's pretty clear that unless you're doing some serious mental gymnastics, that homosexuality is condemned. And the Catholic position on homosexuality is that they're still beloved children of God, but they are, God requires them to live a life of chastity, which in their case means celibacy. Um, Unless they marry a woman, but that probably wouldn't really work out. It's been proven that conversion therapy doesn't work. Conversion therapy is illegal in many places. And being gay is something that you don't choose. In fact, a lot of gay people don't want to be gay. Um, and there's so much shame in people who are gay, and they suffer so much because of these homophobic teachings in the Bible, um, that are just so archaic and stupid. Um, they're just ridiculous teachings. The idea that somebody should be stoned to death because they love someone in a sexual way who is not the sex that they're supposed to love, it's just very clearly homophobia. Just people who are in this archaic time where they have all these strange rituals and practices, like, which is explained in the by the Catholics as saying it's geniusly, it's all foreshadowing the New Testament, the New Covenant, like all that stuff about not being able to eat like pork. Yeah, that was actually that was just symbolic of not mixing in with the Gentile nations, or something like that. Like they'll say it's all symbolism. They'll come up with these amazing symbols to connect the Old Covenant and the New Covenant. When in reality, I think it's just bullshit. I think it's just very clearly a set of practices that came from someone who, um, maybe did have obsessive compulsive disorder, somebody who didn't want the mixing in of clothes, didn't want the it is all connected in the intermixing part, in terms of it's very clear you eat this certain meat, you can't wear clothes that have multiple materials, like it all has to be one material. um, it's I guess it's supposed to in a subtle way tell the Israelites, like, oh no, you're supposed to be one people. um, but if all of this, you're supposed to be one people distinct from the other nations. So all of this is done to tell the Israelites that they are to be distinct from the other nations, only for it to be all undone in the new covenant, where it's like, oh no, now you're all now Gentile or Jew, you're all Christian, but the separation is actually from the sinful world now, or from non-believers or whatever, or you could say from sin. But I'm kind of digressing here, but I just think it's a very silly and archaic teaching that causes so much unbelievable suffering in homosexual people. And I think it caused, if you ever read the book The Velvet Rage, which talks about um, homosexuality and mental health, um, there are so many people who committed suicide, and so many of these behaviors, like this promiscuity, this cheating that was in the gay community in the 80s or 90s or whatever that community was that all this was happening in, um, really links back to shame and people being unable to accept themselves in a culture where homosexuality is just such a viewed as such an evil thing, even though it's not evil at all. And the problem is with saying that as well, is that, and the problem with telling people, oh, just be celibate for the rest of your life, is that sexuality is a major part of being a human. Just looking at it from an evolutionary perspective, we are like, reproduction is like the main thing we do in life. Like, that's like our whole thing. Um, it's not our whole thing, like, we create things, but creating things and reproducing, for most people, having children, reproducing is what they create. That's what they offer the world. For most people, children, like having children, having a family, is their meaning in life. And so, obviously, gay people can't have children uh, when when they have sex together, but having a family, having a husband, a partner to be with for life, that kind of creates the environment for raising children, just historically, and just people being shamed to the point where if you were gay and if you were two gay parents and you had a child, there's so much like of a stigma on those people, and like, obviously gay marriage was just legalized in like 2008 or something. Um, it's just very hard to believe that we've been so entrenched in these archaic beliefs that just taught that these people were evil because of their sexuality. Um, I think I got a little off track there because I was talking about, well, I guess that's just another reason why I don't like Christianity. It's done so much harm to homosexual people. It's absolutely ridiculous, the teachings. And oh yeah, people will say, oh well, look at what the homosexual lifestyle does. It's like you have people who are just so promiscuous, um, and like this is what these people are like, and it kind of reinforces their belief that, oh, if you're not Christian, if you're living a homosexual lifestyle, you're just all in it for the pleasure, and you're just like this sinful person who is just so promiscuous and going from person to person, and that just reinforces their beliefs that homosexuality is wrong. But in reality, those things are caused by immense shame that these people feel. The amount of shame that these people feel should not be underestimated in terms of its effect on people's behavior. And talk to a licensed psychiatrist, and they can tell you how harmful shame can be. and how much it can influence these behaviors and cause these promiscuous behaviors. Um, even knowing that you're different from your parents is very difficult for um, homosexual people to come to terms with, and they need guidance on that. And so imagine not getting any guidance on that, feeling different from other people, and being told that you are, what's the Catholic term for it? Um, your desire is intrinsically disordered. And again, sexuality is a major part of being a human being. I think it's actually underestimated a lot. Um, how much being able to have a sexual partner, a sexual future, um, how important that is to the human psyche. And I think that's a big reason why people kind of associate with gender identities. When I was Christian, we would when we were I was Catholic, I'd have this comeback for people who, um, was like, oh, my gender identity is this or whatever. I never actually talked to someone who said that, but people who associated with this gender identity, my comeback was kind of like, oh, well, our identity should be that we're beloved children of God. It shouldn't be based on something so lowly like our sexuality. But I don't think calling sexuality lowly is entirely accurate. I think that I don't think there's a reason to rank human desires. I think obviously we need to keep ourselves in check, but um, I don't think that entails suppressing ourselves. I believe that the self is inherently good. I believe that problematic behavior, which what Christians would call sin, maybe on some occasions, I believe problematic behavior like promiscuity, alcoholism, uh, even rapists, like that kind of behavior, comes from a place of trauma, comes from a place of mental uh, deficiency, in terms of mental problems like psychopathy. Even psychopaths can be cured. Um, and I think not holding people morally accountable for things they have no control over is a great step forward for humanity. There's a good video on how free will doesn't exist in the broad sense. And basically, the doctor who is talking, talks about how humanity has moved forward for the better when we stop putting moral blame on people um, for things they can't control. For example, epilepsy. People used to think that that was being possessed by a demon, probably due to sin. Or there was something where it was like Down syndrome was thought to be caused by a mother who was unable to love their child. And so the blame was kind of placed on the mother. Now we know that, epilepsy and Down syndrome are uncontrollable, just unfortunate mental deficits. And I think Christianity encourages people to put moral blame in places where there actually is no moral blame. And I think that causes a lot of shame in people, because they feel like they're trapped in an unacceptable state and they can't, that there's something inherently wrong with them. And that just causes a lot of shame. And again, I think shame is one of the biggest problems in, especially people who commit suicide. Um, I think that's a big reason why transgender suicide is so high and was so high, is because there's so much shame surrounding that, for people who, I mean, I was just looking at, there's one transgender content creator I love, Gooseworks, and the first comment I saw on a post they made on Twitter when they first came out was like, someone said, "Oh, look, another one of these crazies." Transphobia is nothing new, so forgive me for explaining this over again, but again, the moralization of things that aren't inherently moral, I think that has consequences for prisons too, because prisoners are put into a place where they are given a new identity, that of a prisoner. I don't think the prison system is very successful. I think I saw a statistic once of how, um, someone who's put into prison, the chance that they get put into prison again, is actually higher after they go to the prison the first time. So it seems like prisons don't really work in terms of reforming people. And I think that stems from the I think prisons are inherently Christian, and I think that they're inherently well, hold on. Not I think our American implementation has elements that are Christian that are harmful in terms of they're moralizing the prisoners in terms of saying that, oh, you did these bad things because you're inherently flawed, and that's why you did these bad things. And it gives them a label of, oh, prisoner, criminal. When in reality, I think generally, and this is kind of a different conversation, but I think generally people should be treated more like patients than as um, criminals, which are people who are flawed. And I think if you look at internal family systems therapy, there are people who did very heinous things that were cured because they were able to um, look at their parts and get in touch with their self. And everyone has this self. So this self is good. And I think we need to stop treating people like they're lesser, even if they do terrible things. That just means that they need help. Some people don't want help. And for those people, they do need to be put in a place that will stop them from harming other people. They need to be put in a place. But what I'm saying is that we shouldn't treat people like they're lesser, even if they do commit crime. I think we should do the minimal amount of maltreatment necessary. I think what we should do is just, in general, treat them as psychiatric patients, especially people who are in inner cities, raised up in gangs. They don't really have a choice to act in another way. Okay, so talked a little bit about some societal consequences of this kind of moralization, this kind of free will claim. Um, let's see. So just to sum up what I was saying about the thoughts, it's like there's a big thing in Christianity when it comes to sin. This goes back to original sin. A lot of it is about self-suppression, suppressing your inherent evil desires. And the problem with suppressing things is that they come out in other ways, which are probably more problematic than the ways you're suppressing them. Suppressing things never works. You have to live to your true self, and Christianity prevents people from living as their true selves, and it makes them feel ashamed for it. And so what happens is in Christianity is that it just becomes toxic in non-sinful ways. So whatever ways are not sin, I think people are going to express these bottled up desires, and it just creates for a very judgmental, toxic atmosphere, I think. So, kind of interesting thing about hell is the idea that people who are in hell choose to be in hell. Nobody would choose to be in a place of eternal torment. Okay, nobody would do that. And if you claim that, you're just delusional. And if you're claiming that is because they, you know, didn't want to be with God or whatever, the reason they didn't want to be with God is probably because they didn't agree with the characterization of the God that you worship. Because they probably found some things in it that just didn't align with what they naturally thought. And the problem with moralizing that is saying that, oh, you're inherently evil because you disagree with me on God. Like all the people who don't agree with the Christians on God, like St. Paul says this. He says that these people actually knew from the very beginning that there was God, and that it's clear and obvious and plain just in nature, just to the human beings. Every human being knows deep in their heart that there's God, but they're denying it because they're just evil, sinful people. And that it's just fucking stupid. I mean, you're judging everyone who doesn't believe in exactly what you believe and saying that that's because there is something inherently evil about them. That's just a recipe for fucking disaster. And that's just an attitude of judgmentalness towards everyone who doesn't agree with what you agree in. And that's another major problem with Christianity that I have. It teaches this major judgmental attitude toward anyone who doesn't share the beliefs you have. And the reason they don't share the beliefs you have is because they're steeped in sin. They're just morally corrupt people, and somehow it's your job to open them up to the light of God, and get them to see the error in their ways. And that they need to change. They're not acceptable as they are. But not only does it teach that once you're in hell, you're incapable. They teach that once you're in hell, you're incapable of wanting to leave. Um, which Okay, so we have free will apparently, but at the time of death, that free will is taken away because apparently there's nothing else that could have done to convince us to become Christian or to accept God or to get to heaven. So for some reason, at the moment of death, your free will is taken away, practically speaking, because you're not going to be able to decide, you're not going to be able to change your mind anymore. And you are stuck in a place of eternal, infinite suffering. Um, yeah, infinite suffering. And apparently they choose to be there. Like what C.S. Lewis says something along the lines of, or this is what modern Christians will say, is that, oh no, God doesn't throw people into hell, even though the Bible clearly says that God throws people into hell. And he literally does that to people. Like in the Old Testament, he throws them in, like Israelites into a pit of fire. Jesus talks about how you'll be thrown into the pit. Like, so the Christians who say that God doesn't put you in hell are just fucking delusional. But no, God doesn't put you in hell. Those people actually choose to be there. And C.S. Lewis has a book called The Great Divorce that talks about people who are in hell. They go on a field trip to heaven, and the book talks about how, oh, um, these people who were in hell, they chose to be in hell. They actually don't want to be in heaven. And one example that's given is someone who is like an artist, and they see this beautiful landscape in heaven, and they complain because they're like, oh, there's no canvas for me to draw on. How will I do paintings? And then it's kind of says that he wanted to sell his paintings or something. Um, Something that seems completely innocent, but oh no, he's not worthy of heaven because he's this poor soul is stuck on these earthly thoughts of painting a landscape. Um, he should just be enjoying it, with his eyeballs. He shouldn't need to paint something. I mean, that's ridiculous. So obviously he deserves to be in hell. Or this kind of idea that these people don't appreciate what's in front of them or something, and so um, they choose to be in hell because they just, I guess he wanted the glory of painting that or something. But it's like that, moralizing that, and saying that this person is inherently flawed because of that, and it's their decision to do that, even though the book, the characters, like it's very clear that these characters, it's just their personality. Like it's not a conscious choice they're making to say, oh no, I don't want to, you know, I don't want to enjoy what's in front of me. No, I don't want to do that. I'm choosing against that. I'm choosing to not enjoy what's in front of me. That's the implication there. And I think that's a silly implication. And again, that just leads to a judgmental viewpoint of other people. And when you have a judgmental viewpoint of other people, you end up with a judgmental viewpoint of yourself. And that just leads to more shame. And so what happens is when you get deeper and deeper into Christianity, you go into these spirals of shame that leads to dependence on God because you're such a miserable creature. And so you become more and more dependent on this fictional character who is an asshole in the scriptures. And somehow you have to reconcile that with the idea that he's an all loving, all good God, even though he continually beats you down. That's basically what the Catholics teach, is that the struggles we go through in our life are kind of meant to beat you down into submission to God, into humility. They chip away at yourself more and more so that you learn to just become one with God. He must decrease, I must increase, the famous quote from a saint that gets quoted all the time. And again, this implication of hell means that God, who sustains everything in existence, is consciously tormenting these conscious souls, the same souls that he apparently created. So, yeah, God is just like a loving father, and that's what any loving father would do. If their child disobeyed them, they would put them in like a little box and just torment them forever. Um, it teaches that it was Judas who was literally with Jesus physically, was not saved by Jesus, who's supposed to be the literal Son of God. And Jesus lets it happen to fulfill a prophecy. You'd think that Jesus would actually care more about him and talk to him to understand him better and address his emotional needs rather than literally setting him up to betray him. I mean, Judas was. Did they never talk about their problems? Did Jesus never talk to Judas about the problems that Judas had with him? No, actually, Jesus said some things that seem to actually imply that he's pushing Judas towards this betrayal. He keeps hinting towards someone betraying him, and he does nothing to talk to Judas about it. And apparently, what it gives off is just this idea that he's just resentful towards Judas, that Judas would even think about it, he thinks that he's Jesus. It seems like he's indignant at Judas for even having that temptation, and so never bothers to talk with Judas about it. Um, so there's other things too in the New Testament, like there's contradictions that Catholics will do mental gymnastics around, but the truth is there's contradictions in the date of which Jesus is said to be crucified, or the time, I mean. And there's contradictions in the people who saw him at his tomb first. If you look at the New Testament, there's a book called How Jesus Became God, and it analyzes the New Testament, and does a good job of showing that Jesus was an apocalyptic prophet who never claimed to be God. And you can see it clearly in the scriptures. He's claiming to be the Son of Man. He's claiming to be a prophet, an apocalyptic prophet. He in John he claims to be God, but there's a good case that that was added in by John for its theological significance. Besides that, there's various other cases in history where people are elevated to divinity. Alexander the Great, Buddha, even Confucius was, I believe, was brought up to divinity. So it just happens with moral teachers. They are raised to divinity. Um, let's see. Yeah, so Christianity leeches off of guilt, shame, and fear to keep itself alive. It's a meme, so it's a mimetic, um, kind of like a. So meme is not like Doge, but the original meaning of meme is the. It's kind of like how an organism evolves over time. It's like that, but for an idea. It's an idea that evolves over time. And this happens through natural selection and mutations. Mutations happen in the way where when a story is told, there are modifications that are made over time by the storyteller. There are things that are emphasized more. There are things that are exaggerated, and those are kind of the mutations. Natural selection is the things that are changed about the story that prevent it from dying out. Or the stories that don't support the main theme, they die out. So that's how you get this big cohesive religion system built, is because of memetics. It's the evolution of these ideas, and they come together into the Catholic Church. And this evolution is seen like kind of clearly in the councils. Like the doctrine has evolved, and they say it's from the revelation that has always been there, but we're only discovering it now, kind of thing. But I think just looking at it from a straightforward perspective, it's the evolution of ideas over time. Um, so let's see. I'm trying to find something I didn't already cover. Right. So Christianity teaches you to be separate from the world, which means not to be, which encourages you explicitly in the New Testament. St. Paul encourages believers explicitly to put their mind to spiritual things, not earthly things. And that is the very opposite of mindfulness. So mindfulness is being present in the moment, paying attention to the present. Whereas putting your mind to spiritual things all the time and not on present things is going to cause you to disassociate in one sense or another. And that's going to hinder your ability to solve problems in the present. That's going to hinder your ability to actually be there for those who need you, I think. It's going to hinder your ability to be genuine and spontaneous. And um, yeah, I think it's harmful. I think it goes into that reinforcing of mental compulsions like prayer, um, that kind of put you in this spiritual trap where you think, if I stop praying and if I start thinking about earthly things, then I'll fall into sin. But I need to keep my mind on spiritual things. And so that is the very opposite of mindfulness, and it keeps you trapped in this like spiritual realm um, of praying without ceasing. That's what St. Paul says. You pray without ceasing. Um, of course, because if you stop praying, then you'll fall into sin. That's what they say in Catholicism very often, the community I was in. The number one thing that stops before people tragically deconvert or lose their faith is prayer. Or that's how people fall into sins because they stop praying. So I would pray all the time. Whenever my mind was empty, I would just fill it with prayer, and it actually made me miserable, and it didn't help me to overcome sin. It actually just made the thoughts more strong because when you avoid thoughts, let's say sexual thoughts, they come back stronger. So um, yeah, I think it's just very clearly harmful. Um, yeah, it teaches you to shy away from things that might question your beliefs. I would say if you, because there, instead of like a scientist who looks at things like, oh, maybe this is true, maybe it isn't true, a Christian is threatened by scientific ideas that could cause them damnation. People who don't believe in eternal damnation don't have this pressure on them to prove their ideas right. So they, either way, um, something could be true, something could be not true. They're able to look at it from a more objective lens. But someone who's Christian who believes in this eternal damnation fears for their life. So if something like that's why you have a lot of fundamentalists who just deny evolution, but then you have Christians who say that they're indifferent to evolution. It's like fine, even though that doesn't really make sense when you try to fit it with. I won't say it doesn't make sense. That's a big claim. I don't want to go into that here. I won't say that, but I'd say it's causes problems when you try to reconcile that with Genesis, especially with the doctrine of original sin. Um, I think there's ways to explain it, like, oh, it was the very first being that was ordained a human, that being sin. It's like, okay, fine. But what I'm saying is that there's a pressure to avoid things that could lead you to sin or lead you to unbelief. Like in confession, there's a prayer and the act of reconciliation that you do. And one of the things you say is, I will avoid whatever leads me to sin. Um, and that could be anything. Anything that moves you towards not having a closer relationship with God, which means not fully believing in all of the scriptures and in everything that the church tells you. Um, yeah, and disobedience is one of the greatest sins. And there's all kinds of stories about people who don't do certain acts of piety or who disobey authority in the church, like their priests, and they're like killed, they're sent to hell. Um, Saint John Bosco, I think there's a story where an old lady um, was yelling at the kids he was taking care of. And John Bosco told her, "Are you sure you're going to be alive by next week?" or something like that. And then she was dead by the next week. So there's stories of Father Ripperger mentions, you know, a 7-year-old, as soon as he turned 7, he committed a mortal sin, and the devils took him to hell immediately. Because apparently, when you're 7, you reach the age of reason. and that's when you're morally capable of mortal sin. So yeah, theoretically, you could just go to hell as soon as you turn 7 years old. Makes total sense. Um, let's see. Oh yeah, you have these hypocritical stories about saints, kind of like what I was talking about, where you have saints that do things that are so silly and ridiculous that you would be shunned from Catholicism. Um, you would be, just shunned if you did those things today. Meanwhile, so let's say Saint Francis of Assisi stripped naked in front of the town to renounce his material possessions. You have another saint who decided to go to Islam. I think it was also Saint Francis of Assisi, who is said to be the saint who was most like Christ, who followed most in Christ's footsteps. Um, he's said to have gone to an Islamic country and attempted to get himself martyred by going to try and convert the ruler of that area, or whatever, and then the person there just uh, decided not to martyr them or something. But he's trying to get himself killed, and that's something that is actually frowned upon today. Even though martyrdom is raised to the highest um, thing you can look forward to. Um, my pastor would constantly talk about stories of martyrs and basically say like these are the examples of the peoples we should be living towards, and that's what the church says, is that the saints are the examples of people we should live towards. It's interesting because there's almost no saints that are there's very few saints that are lay people compared to the number of saints that are actually just priests, or monks, which you could say that's just because of difference of devotion or recognition, but it does imply conflict of interest in saying that almost having a reward for being part of the system um, that acts to reinforce the system. Um, yeah, so here's another thing about Catholicism is that murder is a sin that can be forgiven at confession, and they can't tell the authorities about it because the confessional is strictly locked. However, an abortion is a means for excommunication. Um, so that's right. So someone could murder 15 people, and they'll get their sins forgiven at confession. But if you have an abortion, you're excommunicated, which means you can't be saved unless you go to the bishop and get permission to be brought back into the church, which the bishop can decline. So, as if a woman who has had an abortion isn't already going through enough shame and mental anguish, um, this just adds on top of that. And I think that's a great way to punish people who Jesus would have called the least that should be taken care of. I think that's a great way to drive them into deeper shame and isolation and despair by kicking them out of the one place that is supposed to be a place where they're saved. Yeah, I'm sure Jesus would have approved. What an absolute fucking disgrace. The Catholic Church is a fucking joke. Christianity is a joke. It's not pro gay. There's no pro LGBTQ implication anywhere in the scriptures. Okay, it's very explicitly anti-LGBTQ. So the people who are interpreting it that way are really doing roundabouts, mental gymnastics to do that. And I don't blame them, but I think as a society, it's very hard to let go of these beliefs that we've held as foundations for so long. But I really do think it is time to move on. Um, yeah, so it encourages suspicion, fear, paranoia, and a distance from anything that's not of itself. That's what the scriptures, they always encourage getting deeper into the scriptures, and it seriously mimics a toxic relationship to the T. I've got personal reasons as well why I'm not in Christianity, like God not answering my prayers. But I don't think that's as strong as a thing to talk about in terms of logical reasoning. And I think logical reasoning for me is the most powerful um, and makes the most sense. I have other reasons as well, but I think that's sufficient for this video. And I'd be happy to, respond to any comments. But I really do think it's time for us to move on as a society from Christianity. I think it's extremely harmful to individual psyche, uh, as well as society as a whole. Um, I think there are some things in it that may be good. I think that we should separate the wheat from the chaff.